Good evening and welcome to another NYJavaSIG event. I hope you have a blessed time with us tonight. If you're not yet following NYJavaSIG on Twitter, please follow us. That's where you're going to be notified firsthand about all of our events. We have monthly free events and hands-on workshops, and we would be very happy if you join us. Also, here's our website. We publish all of our events. On top of that, if you're not following us on YouTube yet, I suggest go to YouTube, hit on subscribe. There's tons of content there available to you, and we try to record all of our sessions. So go there, hit subscribe, and be notified when new content is available. Okay, if you have 100% test coverage on your code, congratulations. If you don't, please use the chat here and let us know where are you watching this from. So today we're going to receive Billy Corrando. He's a Kansas City Chiefs fan. Crazy about it, I'm sure. He's also a developer advocate with the Java platform group, and he also co-organized the Kansas City Java user group. Lately, he has been posting weekly videos on Twitter called Sip of Java, where he put a 1-minute video, anything related to Java. So please follow Billy on Twitter, and those videos are really nice, short, direct to the point, and you can learn about it. So our talk today will be how to be a Java automated testing superstars. And with that, I want to introduce Billy Corrando. Billy, welcome. Thanks for being here with us tonight, and I hope you have a good time. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Rodrigo. Yeah, it's actually kind of funny. When I first put together my biography, I put down my Kansas City Chiefs fan, but I also would kind of joke about how I would always experience a lot of heartbreak with them because they would always get to the playoffs and it always lose, and it'd always be in such a humiliating fashion. And it's really nice that actually for once, we actually get to the Super Bowl and stuff now. Granted, we did have, unfortunately, a poor showing the last one, but at least we win a few playoff games now, which is a huge improvement from, for the past compared to the last few decades. So with all that said, as Rodrigo mentioned, my name is Billy Crandall. I'm a developer advocate with Java. And today we're going to be talking about how to be a Java automated testing superstar. And so without much said, let's go ahead and get going. Oh, also, I will be monitoring the chat. So if at any point, actually, I kind of have this in my notes, I'm a very demanding speaker. If you have any questions at any point during the presentation, feel free to ask them, and I'll try to answer them there. There is, I think, about a 30 or so second delay. So if I don't immediately respond to your question, I'm a little bit ahead of where you are, but I will try to go back and answer it if I can, or who knows, maybe I end up answering it by the time anyways. Also, like I said, reach out. My Twitter handle is @BillyCorrando. So you can follow me there. As Rodrigo mentioned, I've been doing a weekly video called Sip of Java, where I do about a minute, and it's just various new features or undercovered or underused features within Java. So it's kind of a good way to learn about things. A lot of times I end up learning about this stuff as well. It just maybe looks like I know what I'm talking about just because, well, I work at the place that makes Java, so I have a lot of great people to turn to for questions. And then also you can email me at billycorrando@oracle.com. So you can feel free to DM me on Billy Corrando, or you can also email me if you have any questions. I'll be more than happy to try to answer them. Also, this presentation, it's available here at this link in PDF format. Need to kind of update a few things on this, but all the same, all the links and all this stuff that I'll be going through here, you can just go to here, download the PDF, and kind of get them all here, so you don't have to worry too much about writing everything down during this presentation. Also, if you have an intense desire to know more about this, about automated testing, I've actually been kind of covering and talking about automated testing for a very long time. And you can go to my website, billycorrando.com, and a lot of what I will be covering during this presentation will also be there. So like there's a few of these topics are pretty complex, and so maybe kind of hard to maybe in about the 5 to 10 minutes I may have to talk about a couple of them to really cover and get into all the depths. But some of it could just be about like, oh, that's an interesting idea, and then maybe I probably have covered it in more detail in like a full blog article. You can kind of go check it out there to maybe get into a few more depth there. I'll point it out for a couple of these things concepts I'll be kind of covering, where it could be kind of good to maybe go check out the article just to get the real more depth and implementation details on actually how to maybe do it if you're kind of running into like some of the issues maybe are a similar scenario I'm talking about at your organization. So with all that said, let's see, let me make sure. Okay, making sure there was no major questions. And also, hi Elmore, glad to see you're here. With that said, obviously, I'm guessing people here are all already at least somewhat interested in automated testing, but I do kind of want to start this presentation kind of going into why we should do it. If nothing else, is that sometimes to maybe help maybe articulate that case for your organization as to why you should do more automated testing. So maybe if you've been trying to make that case and maybe been having trouble to, or maybe just some more things to think about as writing it. These are some of the things I've kind of picked up over time and I would like to share. So like, why write automated testing? Because let's not kid ourselves, writing a quality automated testing suite, that's going to take a substantial time and effort to write the test. And it's a substantial time and effort to maintain the test. It's not some sort of zero cost or like, a very small additional cost to do automated testing. You could very well be spending as much, maybe even more time on automated testing than you do actually writing real production code. So there has to be a really good reason to do this. And also, of course, if you're like me, your code is perfect. I've never written a bug in my life. So why take the time? Why go through all this to write this, to write these tests? Well, we all really probably want to work towards a CI/CD process, continuous integration and continuous delivery, where, but to really do this, the process for that is built, or the foundation of any CI/CD process is built upon a foundation of automated tests. No organization is going to push code to production just because a developer, wrote the code out and be like, oh yeah, it's definitely working. They made it a little couple, simple tests on their system, from their desktop, and then, push that to production. It's not going to work for any meaningful application that's going to production. Maybe some sort of small internal application, maybe in that case, that can go, to production without much automated testing. But for anything of any meaning or substantial business purpose, you're going to need to have some sort of quality checks to do that. And of course, that's going to be automated testing. That's going to be absolutely key. And so how this overall CI/CD, or however a deployment process might go, traditionally, or maybe particularly early on when I was still doing development, particularly like my first couple of places, is us developers, we would work and type away on our computers and fill out business requirements or fix a bug, and then commit our code, and then like our CI server would build it, and maybe it would deploy it automatically. Maybe a lot of places that still might be a whole manual process to actually deploy it out there. But this manual process of writing code out and then sending it and then testing it in an integrations or development area, it could take hours or days, and then eventually it'll get to production. And then there's also another issue that I think is a bit more subtle, but that's also very heavily related to, hey Benjamin, when it comes to the lack of automated testing, and I call this a dependency iceberg. So at least maybe it was just me, but we spent so much of our time, 40 hours, maybe, sometimes more a week working on applications and code and getting it out to production. And, at least would maybe have early on thought like, oh, most of the code that's actually running out in production is code that I have written. And, that's going to be the code I need to check for performance and security and all those things. But really the code that we're actually running out in production, the code that we wrote as developers for our organization, is really only going to be a small fraction of the code that's actually running out in production. Most of the code that's actually running is your dependencies, the code your code runs on. And in here, this is where you're going to have your security patches. This is where you can get like a lot of performance improvements, feature enhancements, and all that. I mean, like a really great example of that, not really in this presentation, is like I took like the Spring Boot Plant Clinic app. If you're familiar with that at all, it is a application that the Spring team put together to demonstrate Spring Boot. And just running it on JDK 8 versus JDK 7 or 17, you could just get a huge performance improvement just from running it on JDK 17 without making any changes whatsoever. So, that's kind of a demonstration of like, where you can get a whole bunch of performance improvements just from running on newer versions of code. And of course, like, Spring or many of the other underlying libraries, they improve performance over time. And of course, probably by far the most important, though, is really security patches. We remember from a few years ago with the Equifax hack, the exploit that actually led that to happening was something that was in Apache struts, but actually it was already fixed by Apache struts by the time Equifax was exploited. But, they were probably many versions behind on their dependencies. And where this all relates to automated testing is that many organizations probably fear updating their dependencies because they don't really know what would happen if you update it, even when it's just a patch version. Even if you're going from version 1.2.4 to 1.2.5, there's going to be that risk that like something breaks. And so if you're dependent upon manual testing, well, that's going to depend, you're going to have to do like a whole regression test to make sure that there's no break in there. And it's even much more significant when you're talking about either going up a minor version, so like 1.2.4 to 1.3.1 or something like that, let alone a major version. So many organizations, just like, they get their dependencies and then they shrink wrap it and they were like, we're just not going to put this in Amber. These are the dependencies that we use for this application. We deploy it every time, and we're just not going to change it just because there's going to be too much of a risk, too much of concern that any of those dependencies changing is going to cause some sort of a break. And that's where having a quality automated test suite can say like, okay, we're going to update some of these dependencies. And if anything breaks, hopefully an automated test suite can, catch that. And so you can actually then do a better job of updating your dependencies with the time as new versions are released, because you have an automated test suite that can catch those if anything were to break. There's other test costs, obvious, exactly how what I was just talking about, that because updating dependencies would often mean a regression test, you wouldn't do them. So that's like one of the subtler costs. Of course, there's other issues with manual testing that when you push to a site and you have manual testers out there, or actually I'll get to that in just a minute. So with an automated process though, developers, they can write the code, you push it to production, or you push it to your code repository, and then your integration server or your build server can take that and then run through your automated test process. And that's going to be a process that can be measured in minutes, and then you can actually go to production from there. So there's also some other key additional benefits to automated testing. One is that it's auditable, that you can, thank you. No hurry. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, but thank you. But it's auditable. So you can go in and look at the automated test code that you wrote and to see what it's actually being tested. You can look at your test reports to see what was actually tested as well, and then also see what failures and the logging and stuff like that to see that, like, yes, we know that this part of code was tested. These are the values that it was tested with, and then this is the kind of result of that test. And And what can happen with manual testing as well is like, okay, you push something to, your integration or your QA there as well. But then you may have it to where like the QA tester, they accidentally tested in the wrong environment, or they didn't do the test the same way they did it last time. So you can get a issue, and they may not know they're doing this. Like they may honestly think they're doing the right thing, but just, because humans aren't perfect, because we're not robots, they just might do something a little bit wrong. And then you may be like, oh, you thought this was tested correctly, but it actually wasn't. Or now you're getting like this error back, but it's because, they did something different this time. And now you don't know what was different. Like maybe they hit like the space bar when in a form field, and then they realize it, and that led to like some sort of real result. They're like, oh, there's this bug now. And you're like, I can't reproduce it. So, you can, because automated tests are fully auditable, you can kind of check and see what was different between the times before. And of course, to that other point is that they're repeatable. You can just run the automated test suite again and hopefully get the same result. And particularly, this is another area going to be really kind of touching on with some of these technologies, is how to improve the repeatability of our tests and the subsequent reliability of our tests. Because what we really need to be able to really depend upon our automated test suite is that it gets the same result every time. That, if I make no changes to code and I rerun my automated test suite, I shouldn't get different results, or it should be within a very narrow band, the difference of results, and particularly shouldn't be, any flickering test where it passes one time and fails the other. But it also should also be within a very narrow band, because if you have it to where, a bunch of tests sometimes fail and sometimes pass, it's not going to give you much faith in that automated testing suite. And then you're going to kind of have to fall back to doing manual testing. And this also gets to the maybe a little bit as to what Rodrigo's a bit joking about with 100% test coverage, is like, well, how many automated tests should I write? Like, what percentage of test coverage? And really, the ultimate answer is whatever gives you confidence to deploy to production without any sort of manual intervention, any sort of manual testing. And that's just going to vary depending upon your organization and the kind of applications you're writing and running. For something that is taking in consumer, like the credit card information or personal information or something like that, you may want to do a lot of testing for that. If it's some sort of batch job that runs weekly and it's just totally internal, well, you may not need too much, automated testing for that. So it's always going to vary. There's not going to be any specific percentage you need to get to. And also there's just some cases where it just doesn't really necessarily makes sense in that area where you could have 100% test coverage, but if you're not doing, it's like the 2 unit test, 0 integration test, to where like, those like maybe 2 kitchen drawers, you try to pull them out, but you can't pull them out together because they would block one another or something. So, specific test coverage can't always be a great metric as well. So ultimately what it comes down to is whatever gives you confidence to where if that automated test is green, the suite is green, it's good to go to production. That's how many tests you should write, and you should take away or add as needed as changes are made to the system and how your organization kind of views automated testing. That said, I was saying negative things about manual testing, but there is still an important point for it, or point area for it, and that is exploratory testing. So it's not going to be, you're going to give your automated or your QA testers or whoever a script and like, you need to do these 3 things all at the same time every time you push to production. You're going to need to have people out there that just continually kind of working with the application and trying to, find, stress test it. What happens if I do these things? What happens if I go back, 3 times and forward 3 times and whatever things like that, to make sure that, there aren't any issues with it. So there's still a role for that, but it's not going to be one of those things as a barrier to getting production. It's just going to be something that's kind of constantly happening in parallel. And of course, maybe if some sort of major bug is found, that's going to stop it until you put to production that issue's resolved. But otherwise, there's not going to be a distinct manual testing step on the path to production. So with that said, what are the tools we're going to be looking at in this presentation? And so for kind of specifically for unit testing, we're going to be looking at JUnit 5, Mockito, and Assert. For integration testing, we're going to be looking at test containers and Spring Cloud Contract. And then actually for performance testing, we're going to be looking, I've only just got started with it, so I don't really know much with it at all. I'm just very much into the hello world phase of this, but a really cool new test library out there is called Jfr Unit, and it's actually going to be able to allow us to do some really accurate performance testing. So I'll more talk about it conceptually and just show like one really simple test and kind of how it works. And then I do have some links on providing my code on areas you can go for more testing, though this was just released as an alpha for Jfr Unit. So it's still very new, still kind of being figured out, but I think it's going to be touching on a very important area within automated testing. Yeah, I believe the only way to ask questions. Yeah, the only way to ask questions is on the YouTube chat. So yeah, if anyone has any questions at any point, definitely feel free to ask. I'll be more than happy to answer them. These are the links, just to know that they're there in this PDF. So, or in the slide deck. They're just there just to know that you can kind of get to links and examples for all of these. With that said, let's actually get into the code. So a while back, when JUnit was first released back in 2017, I put together a demo on what it's kind of like to use JUnit 5. So we're going to kind of run through part of this demo and then kind of look at some of the different parts of JUnit 5 as well. So the first I kind of want to look at is, so here I have a simple, some simple automated tests I wrote using JUnit 4. And hopefully, there we go. Took it a second to run. But this is one really nice thing if, anyone wants to mention if they're using JUnit 5 yet or not. But let's say kind of like the whole about first 15 minutes of this presentation was just like review for you. Like, look, we already have this really nice automated test suite. Like we're happy with it. Like just show me some of the new stuff or whatever. Well, so one of the things is like if you already have like a really existing quality test suite and you're interested in JUnit 5, but you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to completely have to rewrite all my tests to use JUnit 5. Well, one of the really nice things is the JUnit team did a really excellent job of supporting backwards compatibility of JUnit 4 in JUnit 5. So here, even though actually this application that I'm just booking service here is, there we go, is actually, this is all using JUnit 5. These JUnit 4 tests natively run within it. So as long as like you're on JUnit 4 or in one of like the last few releases of JUnit 3 or later, all your tests, you can bring them in or you can add JUnit 5 as your test automated testing tool, and these should all run backwards with backwards compatibility just fine. So you're not going to have to rewrite all your tests to start using JUnit 5. That said, what does it look like to maybe upgrade your tests to JUnit 5? Yeah, parameterized tests are very, very cool. And actually, I'll show a demo of that. And actually, a big improvement of JUnit 5 parameterized test over JUnit 4 ones. There we go. Let me just go ahead and delete all this existing code. So when using JUnit 5, here is for the test. there we go. You want to make sure you're using the Jaina Jupyter API test and instead of the Jaina test. So the Jaina Jupyter API test is what we'll be able to use for the JUnit 5 test. Why are you? That's weird. Then another change within JUnit 5 is within JUnit 4, if you had like an exception being thrown, you would, maybe you would have that exception being thrown out of the method and then try to have the expected exception. But instead, what you would do in JUnit 5 is you would use assert throws. And actually, there we go. I wouldn't want that. You would do assert throws instead. And then you would say the expected exception you get back, and then wrap that in a runnable. Yeah. And then this will return the exception. And then this way, and now I can get rid of this try catch, which is a lot cleaner. And then also this keeps all of the test code actually within the body of the test, instead of kind of breaking it up to where part of like the test would be in the actual code, and then some of it would also be kind of above in a test declaration. So that's another really nice change with assert throws. And like I said, I don't need that whole try catch, like in this example here, where maybe I'm going to check to make sure the message is correct, to make sure, like it's throwing back the correct message that I'm making back to the user, or it's something that, or that it's, yeah, you just can check your message. Yeah, I do. I probably do need to switch to IntelliJ. I've just been so used. I've been using Eclipse for such a long time that like I'm almost afraid of change anymore. Which is a bit ironic given the fact I'm a developer advocate. Like I should be used to change, but only so much change, I guess. So assert all can also be great. So like here, we have multiple assertions within this test. And what can be really annoying in these cases is when you have multiple assertions is like, it ends up being case like 2 or 3 or 4 of these assertions all are in here. And you start running this test and like the first assertion fails. So you go and fix it. And then the second assertion fails. So you go and fix it. And then the third assertion. And it's just like, it's a very frustrating experience whenever that happens. So now you can do assert all to where it will actually wrap all these, and then it will return in a single test run all the different failures that occurred within it. Let's see if I actually try to run it. What is it going to do? Because it should. Unusable. Does anyone want to be a sacrifice to the demo gods so this will get working? Just put it into the QA if you're willing to be sacrificed to appease the demo gods, and we'll send someone over to take that out. But Oh, wait, that's so what I'm showing right now is just how to update your code, like existing JUnit 5 or JUnit 4 test to be JUnit 5. That, you know, typically it's actually a whole lot easier. For some reason, my Eclipse or something is messing up to where it's not importing stuff correctly. And specifically, I'm trying to show off this assert all, which can wrap all of your assertions into a single assertion, which just makes it a bit easier to use. So that way you don't run into the issue of having to run a test multiple times to see where all the failures are happening. Yeah, no fires. So one moment, let me look at some of my pre-existing ones. There we go. Okay, that resolved the build errors or compilation errors. And let's see if that actually runs it now. Okay, so that all actually ran. And so as expected, so here we can see that this test had multiple failures of 4, where it showed then how I went through and I just deliberately made all these different assertions failed. Big Decimal always acts a bit weird with that stuff, but all the same, it does show that all the 4 different assertion failures happened here instead of having to run this unit test multiple times to then go through and fix them all. So, you know, I can fix them all in one single run, which, you know, whenever you run into that issue, it's extremely annoying and frustrating. So that was like a much welcome change to JUnit 5. And then here, the other thing is, let's say your company uses rules a whole lot. For whatever reason, you can use the enable rule migration support, and that allows you to use JUnit 4 rules in JUnit 5. And to do that, you just also need to include this dependency, JUnit Jupyter migration support, to be able to do that. But with that change, all these tests should hopefully run now. Yep, they all pass. Yeah, I saw that they added null source and empty source, and I think coming in JUnit 5.8, they also have null and empty source. I actually haven't used them yet, but I can definitely see how that could be very helpful. A rule is just a JUnit 5 way or JUnit 4 way of kind of like adding some additional like wrapping around a test. So in this example, most people who have done JUnit 5 or JUnit 4 tests are familiar with using this expected exception class or this kind of way of doing expected exception. But another way of doing that is actually with the rule, the expected exception rule. So let's see, where do I? So instead of having to throw that back out, it can kind of wrap this test that can kind of then catch that exception. Rules aren't heavily used, but it's just one of those, if you are using rules at your company and you want to start using JUnit 5 or something like that, that's just a way you can kind of get that support in JUnit 5 with still being able to use rules. But if you're not using them, then you don't have to worry about them. Okay, so someone brought up parameterized tests. And let's kind of quickly, so this is again one of those where if you ever ran into it, it's really, really annoying. But in JUnit 4, to do a parameterized test, you would have to toss a run with parameterized on your class level, and then you could only have one single test case within it for your parameterized test, and then you define your parameters and blah 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 to run your parameterized test, and this will work fine. But the one issue is you can only have one single test case within your parameterized test. And I actually ran into an issue one time when I was a consultant and I was trying to do some sort of long validation for tests. Anyways, there's about like, let's say 24 or so different scenarios could fit within a parameterized test. But then there's these 2 scenarios that kind of existed outside of that test scenario. And I pretty much had to, like, at the time I was only using Jaina 4, so I had to have like one test case that did a parameterized test, or one test class that did a parameterized test, and then another test case or another test class that handled these 2 additional scenarios. In Jaina 5, however, you define a parameterized test at the individual method level, and you can then also still have another test case, like in this example here. So if I run this, I'm not going to be doing TestNG, Selenium, or Geb. Primarily, we're going to be looking at JUnit 5 as like the major base underlying testing framework, and then we're going to be looking at some other libraries that kind of link into with JUnit 5 to kind of fulfill different kind of needs in this presentation. Not to have anything against those other ones, it's just that that's just what I've experienced just with test or JUnit 5. So here in this example, this is what a JUnit 5 parameterized test looks like, where I can have a parameterized test here, and in this case, I'm using a method source, and then I can also just have like a normal test case in here as well. So that's a real nice thing that, again, it's one of those, if you ever run into it, it's very frustrating, but it's really nice how in JUnit 5, it's easier to use. You can just define it at the individual method level. And there's many different sources you can use for JUnit 5. So in this example, I'm using a method source. And in this case, you can even actually reference an external data source or external class. So in this case, I'm actually loading the data in this class for the test. But also you can just do it within the same test class or anything like that. We're actually going to get into that. So yeah, we're going to be touching on Mockito a little bit here in just a moment, and also actually a really good tool for doing database testing that I think actually could be maybe generally better than Mockito, as much as I like it, but I think, can be better than Mockito for those users, particularly for database testing. But we'll get to that in just a few moments here. So parameterized testing is really great. The couple of other things I want to touch on with JUnit 5 is, let's see, where is it? Oh yeah, that's on a controller. So another thing that where automated or where test coverage can be kind of bad is when it comes to certain kinds of functional testing, particularly cross-cutting concerns. So like one of them could be security, or another one in this example is like, let's say you have a RESTful API and you're accepting data from different clients, and one client sends you data as JSON and another client sends you data as XML. And, you may progressively add new endpoints and stuff like that. So if you're just doing by code coverage, making sure that you can accept like JSON, like testing that code, that this post mapping that maybe I have in this code here, every time like we add a new post mapping, you get 100% test coverage from just saying like, oh, I'm testing JSON, but you may forget to like set up to where you also accept XML. So that can be an area where automated or code coverage can lie to you, but also this can be a very easy area to forget to write tests to cover. So a really cool way in JUnit 5 is what they have is called dynamic tests. And it's it's like long, complex topic, but I just want to at least talk about where it can be useful. And this is, again, one of those areas what I was talking about earlier on, where I have a blog article that kind of really goes into depth on dynamic tests. And you can kind of read it there if you're kind of running into a scenario like this or where this could be helpful. But if you have those cross-cutting concerns like security, working with databases or something like that, or accepting kinds of data at certain data entry points or something like that, this could be a really good area for dynamic tests. And so in this case, what I am doing is testing the accepted media types for my post endpoints. And all this is just kind of code that's just scanning my class or my project for post mappings. And then it's going to send in two requests, one with XML, one with JSON. And it's just going to make sure I don't get a 415 error back, which is saying it's not accepted media type. And so we can see here, I can run this test now, and it should get it should run 4 different tests. So yeah, we see that it runs 4 different tests for the 2 different post endpoints that we have. If I go in here to my code, into my room service here, and if I remove this post mapping, and I run that test again, we can see then it's only 2 test runs because there's only 1 post mapping. So I know this is kind of complex and kind of high level, but if you're ever running into like again some sort of cross-cutting concern with what you need to test, like in security, in this case accepted media types and something like that, definitely look into dynamic testing. And I think you can even probably Google Jaina 5 dynamic testing, and it may even come up with my blog article that can kind of go into how to actually implement that, because that's like actually a really useful thing that kind of can cover one of the more difficult things of automated testing. There's a whole lot more to Jaina 5, but let's go ahead and kind of get on to some of the other test tools, just because, yeah, it's already about 6:15 my time, 7:15 your time. So yeah, I want to kind of show off some of these other tools to kind of get into them then. Let's see for Mockito. That was the next one. Yeah, I wanted to talk about. So Mockito is a really great tool for when so mocking is something that can be very controversial. It seems like about once a month, it becomes a hot topic on Twitter where probably someone runs into some issue in their automated test suite where someone misused some mocks to where like they kind of completely mocked up like some service. And really what ended up is happening is our test is validating the behavior of the mocks and not the actual code that's being tested. And then, pretty much what happens then is that what the code is testing doesn't match what's actually going to production. And you end up with some sort of bug. The person found this, realized, oh my God, mocks are terrible. They understandably go to vent on it on Twitter. And then a bunch of other people kind of jump in with other similar experiences saying like, oh yeah, mocks are terrible. And so like it becomes like a topic for about 2 or 3 days where everyone's saying like mocks are awful. And of course they can be, like almost anything, they can be misused. But the important thing to kind of remember is with like mocks is they are great for simulating like you want to make sure whenever your tests are running, like you're only testing, like all the assertions are the actual code that's actually being done. And the mocks are just supposed to be simulating certain conditions of the underlying dependencies. So like you want to see what happens if like your database sends some sort of exception, maybe setting it up to where it will send an exception because like it gets like a null value would be difficult. But the mock can say like, okay, it just shows an exception. And then how does your code react to that exception is really what you want to do. Jaina 5, one of the nice things, and with within like the last 2 years, Mockito also better supported Jaina 5, and you have this like Mockito extension to where you can just pass in at mock or to pass in mocks directly within your code and then to set them up that way. I think this is a really nice way then within your code to also show the kind of dependencies this code depends upon. You can just from here know that like, okay, this test is depending upon like this dependency to mock and another dependency to mock. So you can kind of get a structure and understanding, like an architectural understanding of your code, just kind of from looking at the method signatures of your code. but yeah, I've always found Mockito to be very flexible and pretty easy to use. Like I've tried like a few of the different frameworks, granted not too recently, mocking frameworks, but I've always kind of found Mockito to be the easiest and most flexible to use. That like it's always pretty straightforward to where you can do a when and a then to like set up the behavior of the mock, which is quite nice. Let's see. Oh, and the last thing also for just a unit testing I want to cover is also assert J. Yes. Is that assert logging statements, I think? No. One moment, let me see if I can find it real quick. Yeah. So at least where I'm going to go with assert J is one thing with JUnit 5 or any JUnit, how they do assertions, I found it a bit confusing because I've always got like it back, or for a while I got it very backwards with like how assert equals works, where is it your actual which side is it, on the right side or the left side? I think for a long time I had it on the right side when it was actually reversed. With assert J, they make it a lot more clear how that behavior actually happens. Let's have my example handy for that. Well, here we can just, with assert J, we can do simply assert that this. So instead of insert equals like this, you can do assert that is equal to this. And that just becomes a lot more clear in its intent than what it is then with JUnit 5 or with JUnit. Assert that this value is then your equal to your expected value is a lot clearer than how the standard assert equals works. And for what it's worth, with like the JUnit 5 team, like they didn't go through and change any of this stuff, just because like particularly for assert equals, like either side you put this stuff on, it could always be confusing to half of the people. So instead they just kind of left it to like additional frameworks to kind of come in and provide different assertions that can be a little bit more clear in the intent on how they work. So definitely, I would strongly recommend when doing assertions to use assert J instead of this a standard JUnit 5 assertions, and you don't have to worry about any sort of compatibility when it comes to that. So under the covers, what JUnit 5 is looking for is an assertion exception. And that's what then these assert equals or assert that throws. So there's not going to be any sort of compatibility issues or anything like that when it comes to using a different assertion framework than the standard assertions that come with JUnit framework itself. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about, so someone kind of brought up about using Mockito for doing database testing. And there's definitely absolutely valid cases to do that. However, a really great tool for doing assertion testing or doing database testing or doing any sort of external service testing is test containers. So what test containers is that you have to have it with Docker, but what it allows you to do is doing integration testing locally, but in a much more robust way than what you could do with using something like Mockito or H2 or anything like that. What test containers does is allows you to spin up a Docker container locally, and you can kind of configure what that Docker container looks like, and then have your test run against that. So in this example, or in this code, like this hypothetical booking service, it connects to a Postgres database. And, setting up a Postgres database locally could be time consuming. You would also have to do a lot of work on making sure that your local database matches with what's in production, both like the versioning and then like the underlying data scheme and structure. And it could take a lot of work to actually do that. So with test containers, you could have your image of what your database is supposed to look like out in your shared container repository, and just bring that down and then run your test against it. And then what's a lot better about doing with test containers and running locally is that when you're trying to connect to some sort of like integration service or anything like that service could be down at the time you're trying to connect to it. Data could go missing. It could be configured differently. It could just become overloaded. All these different things that could cause your test to run really slow or start failing. And particularly when they start failing, and it's failing because those other reasons I mentioned, not because of some sort of code change, but because like just data changed, you start to lose faith in those tests. You're like, oh, okay, no, it failed because of this reason. And you just like start ignoring the failure or something like that. And then you start to lose confidence in your automated test. And that's where test containers, it can give you a lot more confidence because you're running locally, and you can set that whole database up at runtime to match exactly what you're looking for, and to make sure that if it fails, it's because of like something actually changed in the code or something that changed in the actual database in production, and you actually need to update it. In other words, failures are always becoming more meaningful and not just like because something that happened. But yeah, let me go ahead and just run this. Oops. Actually, that's going to take a minute. I need to get my Docker started. But yeah, you do have to have Docker to run this. But it's a really great tool. Well, that is starting up. Let me go ahead. But you can go to test containers. But yeah, you can go to testcontainers.org to read more about it. And, it's Docker containers, so you can pretty much put whatever you want within a Docker container. It can work, but they also have many kind of pre-configured things as well. So it's still starting up here, my Docker locally. Just give it a couple more moments for it to start. All right, there we go. I can run it now, and then we can see here in the console that it will go and it will start up a Docker image right here for my Postgres Docker database table, or my Postgres database. And then it will run through these tests, and hopefully everything will pass. And yep. So yeah, that's definitely one of the really nice thing. One of the definitely things to kind of keep in mind is test containers. It's an excellent tool. Probably, I think the best things about test containers is that like it just works. It's not too difficult to use. It kind of all works as expected. One other quick thing back to JUnit 5, they added is the ability to order tests. There's several different ways of doing it. I don't want to get into all of them, but by far the most common way of doing it would be with test method order, and then using the order annotation to where you explicitly provide an order to how the test would be executed. And then what's also nice with how they implemented it is like, let's say the only thing, like I just want to make sure that this test runs before anything else, and I don't really care the order of the rest of my tests run in, then I can just define just the order for just this one test, and then this one will run first, and then these will kind of run in some other random order later on. So that's really nice. And also, if you need to have some tests run at the very end, what you can just simply do also integer.max value, then this test instead would run at the very end of it. And of course, if you have like 3 tests, you need to run in order to end. You could just do like integer value max 1, max 2, max 3. And that's a way you can get some tests to also execute at the very end of your test class, or of course also first. So there's a few other ways of doing it, but I think 99% of people who are going to be doing test method ordering with JUnit 5 are going to be doing it with the order annotation. So that's how you would do that with JUnit 5. The next thing I want to cover, again, going to try to be pretty quick about it, is what is called contract testing. And the way I've worked with contract testing is with using Spring Cloud Contract. However, if you're not using Spring as an organization, another tool for that, a popular one, is called Pact. And the implementation details are going to be fairly different, but the concept is still the same. So let me go and show what this looks like. GitHub repositories. There we go. So what contract testing is what it allows you to define the behavior between services, like what's supposed to happen. So like here, I define a contract, and it's going to define when I do a post call to the API v1 endpoint, and I send it like a body that has like a name, subname, and quantity, then I can say what I can expect back. You know, I can expect back a 200 response back, and it's to get this kind of response as the body, this kind of response as the headers, and so on. What's also nice with at least Spring Cloud Contract, and I'm sure this is also in Pact, I haven't used it with it, is you can also add some variability. You can have like regex matchers, and you know, you can have it to where like here I'm doing like a regex on the name. I just want to make sure like the name is like alpha orange characters for maybe adding produce. But what this allows you to do then is Spring Cloud Contract can actually read this and programmatically then test to make sure that your application is actually fulfilling what's defined in this contract. You can, of course, define multiple contracts. You can also define failure behaviors. So like in this case, if I don't send like a name value, then I should get back a 400 response saying I have a mission required value. So if I go into my code, go into my service, and let's see, I think, yeah. So I can run my test here. I think that should work. Let's see, run as Maven test. I think that's what I need to do. So as this is spinning up, so what it will do, I have it configured to where it can go out and to my GitHub repository, and it will read in these contracts and then test my actual code to make sure that it's matching the contracts. And I got a build failure, compilation error. Okay, it's unfortunately been a few minutes since I last run these tests, so there could be something wrong with them right now, so I apologize for that. But what it allows you to do is run this test to make sure that it actually matches to it. And what you can also do then is, and I have some articles on how to go through this, is you can actually also take these contracts and then write it to where they can act as a mock of your service as well. So that way, for your front end or for whatever client that is connecting to the service, they can also get an accurate simulation of what the service is supposed to look like without having to actually connect to it, which can then also help from the automated testing perspective of the client, that they're not going to have to actually run a instance of the service or connect to some sort of instance in like a QA or integration region to test, they can actually have that stable test, kind of like we saw with test containers, to where then I can get the variability of like data not being correct. The contracts are, you write them by hand. You have to, you would know what the correct behavior is, based upon business requirements or whatever, what have you. So you would actually have to write out these YAML tests, yourself. There's other ways of writing it. I found YAML in this one real case. YAML is actually a little bit easier to use than others, but you can also do it like Groovy and a couple other different languages. But yeah, you would actually have to write this out saying like, okay, if I make a GET call to this endpoint, what should I expect back, from it then? Yes, true. Very much true. Especially since I haven't done it for a little while now. Haven't particularly worked at this specific project for a little bit. I'm kind of getting back into some of my speaking circuit now, so I'm a little bit rusty in some of these areas. This is only the second time I've given this presentation, but Spring Cloud Contract really does, our contract testing really does fill that important niche of doing integration testing between services. So it would, yeah, exactly. YAML's never the easiest choice. That is definitely true. And like I said, luckily you can do stuff in Groovy and some other languages as well. So you don't have to use YAML like I'm using in my example. But definitely check that out. Again, this is a good area where this is a really big topic. Like I even have entire presentations devoted to this topic. So definitely check out maybe some of the articles I wrote on it if you're kind of interested in where this can maybe be helpful for your organization, because this is not going to quite have the time to really get into the depth here. The last thing, and this is also going to be very high level, is Jfr Unit. So they just released their first alpha version of this just last week, I believe. So what Jfr Unit does, I don't know, well, I guess it's kind of harder since everyone's just online, but Jfr is an acronym that stands for Jdk Flight Recorder. Jdk Flight Recorder is a great and severely underused tool for monitoring events and metrics within your Java application in the JVM. So like it can monitor for when you're allocating memory, for when like a thread is going to sleep, for when garbage collections happen, a whole host, like kind of everything that's kind of going on with within your Java application or within the JVM. It can capture that events for you to give you an idea. So performance testing has always been like a very difficult area within the world of automated testing, because it can be really hard to know, like, okay, we run this test, and to know, like, there's so many different metrics, how long does it take, resource usage, and all these things. And it can be so variable in what happens. Like, okay, this performance test took longer than last time. Is it because network issues? Is it because there's additional workload on this server that we just don't know about that's causing the slowdown or limit the throughput, or any of these things? It can be very hard. And then there's always this issue of, isn't it accurate representation? Because like, unless you're going to production and performance testing, if you're running it in QA, maybe that database server is in the same region, but in production, it's in a different region from where your actual application is running. So that performance test in QA doesn't really relate to what the application would be like in production. Luckily, what Jfr Unit does is, what it allows you to do is look for, it can read into the events that are being generated by the Jdk Flight Recorder and say like, oh, okay, this is like new object allocation, this is memory usage and things like that, or this is thread usage and garbage collection. And there's a lot of different events that you can track for. And it can allow you to do it all within like a much more stable region of unit testing from your system that wouldn't really matter what kind of system you're running on. So it should be stable in what it does, and it shouldn't really matter whether it's running on your local machine or whether it's running on your database or on your build server. The results should be the same because it's actually testing what the JVM is doing and not what the actual underlying system is doing. So there's not too much to show you. I do here within this code repository, I linked to, so Gunnar Morling, he's the lead writer on Jfr Unit. And he has a really great article on how to use it and kind of like some of the areas it covers. But this is definitely, I think, a really important area for automated testing that kind of touches on one of the most difficult parts of automated testing, which is performance testing. And it can give you much more stable results than what you could from maybe some other performance testing, and also just a much easier way to do it. But where this could be helpful then, to kind of complete the circle, is like you can run this test and you can kind of figure out what the expected results and like how many database, like how many allocation events should we expect. And then you can compare that results over time and, you know, maybe make some sort of change of the code to where it's creating a whole lot more objects. You can do that and you can be able like, oh, okay, actually our memory usage is really going up, and you can actually then track that change to something specific instead of being only when like a fully deployed application where it can be very difficult to know what was actually changed between the different versions of it. So for right now, I don't want to get too much into the implementation of Jfr Unit, only just to kind of really say it's out there. And if you're struggling with performance testing at your organization, or you actually want to be able to do performance testing in your organization, this can definitely be something good to check out. And hopefully, you know, I do hope to kind of actually start putting together some examples here in the near future when I find some time to do it, which is always a bit of a difficulty. So with that said, I think that kind of covers most of what I wanted to for this presentation. But I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. I'll go ahead and put this up here for the my GitHub repos. But if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than
I'll ask the first question because I don't have 20 seconds of lag, and that will give people time to think of the second question.
Thanks.
You've shared a number of libraries outside of core JUnit, like the one for using @rules and Jfr Unit, which is on the screen right now.
Yeah.
Are there any other third-party or common libraries that you recommend people be aware of if they're using JUnit 5?
Not offhand right now. I mean, there is, and like I think that's one of like the real good changes they made with JUnit 5, and I'm sure you know because you've been presenting on JUnit 5, is that like they made a change to where JUnit 5 just kind of serves as a foundation, and then a lot of other libraries and, you know, organizations can kind of really build upon that to kind of fulfill their different needs. So yeah, probably, yeah, I can't think of other the ones I mentioned. I mean, there's definitely a lot of them out there, but I can't think of any good examples right now outside of the ones I just mentioned.
I'd like to plug one. JUnit Pioneer.
Oh, yes.
JUnit Pioneer has a good number of extensions and stuff. And also I wrote a tool to migrate from JUnit 4 to 5, and they adopted it, which is awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah. Now I feel terrible because Nikolai Parlog, he's like one of the lead writers on it. He's one of my team members. So I hope he doesn't see this. He's going to be probably very upset.
You'll have to tell him it was a setup so that I could talk about it. It's okay.
Okay. I'll be sure to do that. Yes. Thank you for the question. Anyone have any other? Okay, it looks like Mohammed has a question. Looks like he maybe hit return too soon.
Yeah, he has half a question.
Yeah. Any Jaina book recommendations? You know, not offhand. I've been reading Jaina 5 kind of like as it was being developed. So like I was always kind of like following it as it was being written. So I didn't like, there wasn't any books out when I was kind of learning about it. And then I learned enough about it that I really didn't need a book by then. However, one book recommendation I do have here, let me get it, is Continuous Delivery by Jess Humble and Dave Farley. This is like, out of like any book that I've written, or not written, out of any book that I've read in my career, that has really had the most profound impact on how I kind of view software development. It's kind of what really got me into automated testing, because you can, from kind of reading that, you kind of learn, like, oh, not the lack, when you're depending upon manual testing, that kind of like goes to a lot of the underlying issues you maybe have in an organization on why it's so difficult to get to production and why all of our dependencies are out of date, and so many other issues. So I would definitely give that book a read for sure. Comparing to contrast Jaina and TestNG, I think with JUnit 5, I haven't followed TestNG too much recently. My experience with TestNG is really about like 6 or 7 years old now. I only kind of used it once for a little bit, and I think it was fine. It at the time it offered some things that JUnit 4 didn't, but I think since then, unless TestNG, I'm sure it's probably been updated since then, but I think felt like JUnit 5 kind of filled in a lot of those gaps that TestNG provided that JUnit 4 didn't provide. So I don't know. I think a lot of it will also kind of come down to maybe just taste or familiarity with it. Yes, I do have a I have a course on on Pull site. If I guess I'll go in and do a quick plug for it. But I wrote it a little while ago. It was released back in early 2018, wrote it mostly 2017. But yeah, automated testing with Spring. So definitely, it can be if you're a Spring Boot developer, it can be pretty good. A lot of the principles remain the same, but it is about 3 years out of date. I wrote it using Spring Boot 1.5, and obviously we're getting pretty close to Spring Boot 3, so it's a little bit out of date, but definitely check it out if you want. Compare and contrast, book recommendation. Yeah, thank you for also posting the JUnit 5 documentation. Like they really did an excellent job with their documentation. Like really half of the time whenever I've given a presentation on JUnit 5, it's just really me kind of repeating what's in the official documentation. Yes. So Mohammed's question is, as a new developer to unit testing, is it convenient to use test container to test my database for by database management? And absolutely, it's excellent. Like, because I've always kind of ran into the issue, like if you've done as a new developer, you'll eventually run into, if you try to depend upon some sort of integration or existing database where data will change, someone will or go out of date or any number of other things, or maybe that integration database doesn't actually match what's in production. And test containers kind of solves a lot of that. So not only like is it convenient, like it would be like it's like not just like an easier way, but like a really like the way you should be trying to do integration testing for your database versus actually connecting to a live service. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining me. If you have any more questions, I'll wait a minute or two more. But if not, shoot me a message on Twitter or send me an email. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions, anything Java related, anything automated testing related. I'll be more than happy to answer them. But thanks everyone for joining me. Thanks for all the questions. It lets me know that I wasn't putting everyone to sleep. So that's always nice. All right. I'll let you, Rodrigo, kind of take over.
All right. If there are no more questions, I think it's time for our raffle. I would like to thank our sponsors, JetBrains and Agile Learner. So we're going to start with the Agile Learner. It's a subscription for 1 year. So the way it's going to work, I'm going to ask you to put on the chat a number between 0 and 29. The closest one will win the 1 year subscription. So let me get here. Oh, should wait a little bit. So you can see this screen. I don't see Zoom now, Jean. You can see the screen fine?
Yes, I can see the screen fine. And in 20 seconds, our attendees will be able to see the screen fine.
All right, again, a number between 0 and 29. The closest one wins a 1-year subscription to Agile Learning.
Is it the closest one or the closest one module 30?
Yes, the closest one won the 30.
All right, physically on a wheel.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, NYJavaSIG. I'll talk to you guys later. Have a good one.
Thank you, Mitty.
All right,
Nice
bye.
to have you. 21, 18, 7. Wait. A little bit more. $77. 0 and 29. I have. All right, I think we have a few. Should we go? All right, so let's start with the Agile Learner. I'm not gonna be able to see my screen when I do this, but all right, let's go.
Yeah, we actually can see it because it's in presenter mode, so we see the comments and the wheel.
Okay, and number 8. Number
Right.
8. Help
So
me.
we had a
please.
7. That was pretty close.
I see a 7. Emily. So I think we have a winner. Emily,
Mhm.
what is agent, right? Okay, so we have Emily. Perfect. You're the winner of the Agile Learner subscriptions. Now we're gonna raffle 2 JetBrains license for 1 year, so you can use the IntelliJ version. So let's do it again. So let me put a. Should we ask for a new number, or we keep the same numbers?
I think we should keep the same numbers to
All
make
right.
this easier.
Keep the same numbers. So let's go. First one, 24. Let's see if we're gonna need a second number or not. So 24 was the.
I see 22. I see 2 different people put 22.
Or 3. I see Mohammed Stekaya,
Yeah.
22. Yeah.
Okay.
So we have 3 22s.
How would you like the winners to claim their prize?
All right. We can have 3 winners for the JetBrains license. That's fine. Why not? Okay, so the winners, please send your contact to the NYJavaSIG link, or put here in the chat your email address if you don't mind, or you can send a message to the NYJavaSIG on Twitter with your email address. All right.
Okay.
Perfect. I appreciate. Our next event probably is going to be on September. Remember, September is the release of the next long-term support, Java 17, and we should have one event related to that. If you want to know more, if you get notified, follow us on social media. And once again, thank you very much for joining us. Have a good one.